I was scrolling through the feed the other day and my brain just sort of short-circuited. First, I see this clip of a high-ranking Japanese politician, Sanai Takaichi.
Oh, yeah.
She's at a podium. The atmosphere is incredibly stark and serious.
Yeah.
She's using this very specific cold language, talking about a Taiwan contingency as a survival-threatening situation.
Very direct.
Every word feels calculated. It's pure zero-sum geopolitics. It's the kind of rhetoric that immediately makes you think about national security, worst-case scenarios, and a relationship that's fundamentally on ice.
Right. High alert stuff.
Then, literally 2 swipes later, I land on a different post. It's this brightly lit photo from an awards ceremony. It's for the 21st All-China Japanese Essay Contest.
Ah, the cultural exchange side.
Exactly. It's all smiles, students, and officials talking about mutual understanding and building bridges. And this isn't some new, naive PR move. It's been running for over 2 decades, straight through every political crisis.
Yeah, that's remarkable persistence.
You just sit there for a second, staring at the screen. How do these 2 things exist in the same week, from the same country? One channel is openly preparing for a potential conflict. The other is busy funding cultural exchange.
It looks like a contradiction, a huge one.
A massive, glaring contradiction. A sign of a completely dysfunctional strategy. But what if it's not? What if that deep contradiction, that bifurcated reality, isn't a bug? What if it's the entire point?
That's the fascinating question.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
This juxtaposition is confusing, but maybe this deep contradiction, this bifurcated reality, is actually a deliberate and sophisticated strategy, not just for Japan, but maybe reflected in China's own approach too.
What's fascinating here is that we aren't just looking at 2 contradictory policies floating in space, hoping no one notices the tension.
Right.
We're looking at a sophisticated strategic landscape where both Japan and China operate on parallel tracks. One focused on immediate hard security driven by near-realist concerns, and the other focused on the long-term reality of economic and cultural connectivity.
2 tracks running side by side.
Exactly. So our mission today really is to analyze this dual approach, understand its effectiveness, and crucially investigate how China strategically manages and perhaps leverages Japan's necessary internal balancing act. This tension, this seeming paradox, might just be the central mechanism that manages stability in East Asia.
Okay, so that structural tension, having to prepare for war while facilitating trade, that really defines Japan's position, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
They have this foundational security reliance on the U.S. alliance, which demands they externally balance against a major power.
The classic security posture.
But simultaneously, they have this deep, unavoidable economic interdependence with that very same power, China.
Yeah, that's the rub.
It's an impossible position, really, which necessitates this dual hedge strategy we're talking about.
Precisely. And the first track, let's call it the engagement track, is basically dictated by economic gravity. You just cannot discuss Sino-Japanese relations without acknowledging the massive tectonic shift that occurred around 2010.
Right, when China's economy overtook Japan's.
Yeah, when China surpassed Japan in nominal GDP, that wasn't just a milestone, it was a fundamental reordering of the region. A really big deal.
And the gap has only widened since then.
Dramatically. By 2020, China's economy was roughly 3 times larger than Japan's. That level of scale fundamentally changes how Tokyo has to approach Beijing. It's not optional.
And the integration followed that growth, didn't it?
Yeah.
We often talk about global supply chains, but the depth of the integration between these 2 specific nations is, well, exceptional.
It's incredibly deep.
Think about the physical presence. By 2012, you had 7,700 Japanese affiliates operating in China.
7,700.
Yeah, representing 1/3 of Japan's total overseas affiliates. That's staggering.
It is. And the complexity goes beyond just the sheer number of factories or offices. We really have to talk about agglomeration economies.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It means it isn't just about manufacturing widgets anymore. It's about this deep industrial density. When you set up production in certain Chinese coastal regions, for instance, you get access to highly specialized labor, specific tooling, and even proprietary knowledge that you simply can't easily replicate somewhere else overnight.
The whole ecosystem.
Exactly. You have these sophisticated just-in-time delivery networks, all optimized for specific components, maybe developed over years. The cost and the sheer disruption involved in trying to move that entire dense network, It's immense. It effectively locks businesses in to a large extent.
Which then feeds into the second big economic driver.
Yeah.
The consumer market itself, right?
Yeah.
That rising Chinese middle class.
Huge factor. It creates what economists call the largest home market effect. So it's not just about where you make things anymore. It's about where you sell things. It's about revenue outputs now, too.
Makes sense.
Absolutely. For huge Japanese brands like, say, Uniqlo, Shiseido, Toyota, Honda, their long-term growth, their global market position, it really hinges entirely on successfully engaging with the Chinese consumer.
Toyota and Honda, especially in the auto sector.
Right. They rely heavily on their joint ventures in China, particularly now with electric vehicles. That development and sales push in what's considered a non-sensitive sector. If they fail to compete effectively in the world's largest consumer market, they risk being marginalized globally. It doesn't matter how tense things get politically sometimes.
So this economic pragmatism, it sort of forces Japan's hand on some of China's major initiatives too, doesn't it? We saw that play out with the AIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank.
We did. Japan initially refused to join as a founding member. They cited governance concerns, which were legitimate from their perspective.
But then they found themselves having to carefully navigate the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. Couldn't just ignore it.
No, the BRI presented a major diplomatic challenge. Completely rejecting it would signal, absolute geopolitical alignment with the U.S. hardline position,
Right.
And that could potentially jeopardize those crucial economic ties we just talked about.
So they shifted tack.
The shift came under former Prime Minister Abe around 2017. He didn't reject the concept outright. Instead, he kind of welcomed the BRI's potential to contribute to prosperity, but with conditions. Big conditions.
Okay, what were those specific conditions? Because this seems key to understanding the strategy trying to shape the rules, not just avoid the game.
Exactly. The conditions were very specific, and they were designed really to set a kind of global benchmark. Abe insisted that any BRI projects Japan might consider cooperating on must adhere to principles like openness, transparency, economic efficiency, and, crucially, financial soundness.
So basically, international best practices.
Pretty much. It was an attempt to manage China's expansion by, let's say, encouraging it to adopt rules familiar to the G7 framework. The idea was to mitigate the risks you hear about, like debt traps or opaque contracts. It was a form of conditional engagement designed to limit the potential negative externalities of a huge development initiative that Japan simply couldn't afford to ignore completely.
And that emphasis on rule-based engagement, that carries over into the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, right?
Yes, definitely.
Now, for many people listening, RCEP looks a bit like China, setting the rules for the region. How institutionalized is that cooperation, really? What specific teeth does it give Japan when trade friction pops up, especially compared to something stricter like the CPTPP?
That's a really crucial question. And you're right, RCEP is fundamentally different from CPTPP. The CPTPP is much deeper. It has much higher standards on things like labor, environment, state-owned enterprises. RCEP is, well, shallower. It focuses mainly on tariff reductions and rules of origin.
Simpler trade stuff.
Mostly. However, Japan's decision to join RCEP was still highly strategic. It essentially locked China into a multilateral, legally binding framework that does include an institutional dispute settlement process.
Okay, so if a Japanese exporter, say, faces an arbitrary customs blockage or some kind of non-tariff barrier in China, there's actually a formal route to challenge it. It's not just down to bilateral diplomatic pressure.
That's the idea, exactly. Now, the dispute mechanism, it's often consensus-driven, maybe slower than, say, the WTO mechanism used to be, but it still provides a degree of predictability. It gives Japan a tool, a process to manage friction without having to escalate every single trade issue to the highest political level.
So it keeps things contained, hopefully.
Right. Joining RCEP from Japan's perspective was really an exercise in strategic engagement. It's about reinforcing a rule-based order, even within a bloc where China is the dominant economy. It's about trying to ensure that competition happens within a predictable framework rather than in a purely ad hoc, potentially coercive environment. #2, the security counterweight, the hedging competition track.
Okay, so that's the engagement track. Deep integration managed by conditional cooperation and trying to embed rules.
Yeah.
Now, running parallel to that, Japan is aggressively building up its security counterweight. And the core of this, always, is the U.S.-Japan alliance.
The U.S. alliance remains the absolute foundational layer, yes. That dictates the necessity of external balancing against China. But what's really fascinating is how Japan has internalized the security challenge over the last decade or so, really shifting its own institutional architecture.
How so?
Well, establishing the National Security Council, the NSC, back in 2013 was a start. But the creation of the NSC's economic unit in 2020, that was the real signal.
Linking economics directly to security.
Precisely. That signaled that economic policy could no longer be treated as separate from national security interests. It placed economic vulnerability squarely under the lens of security risk assessment.
And the security dominant strategic direction, it then translated directly into new laws, didn't it?
It did. The proposed Comprehensive Economic Security Promotion Act, or CESPA, from 2020 is maybe the clearest articulation we have of Japan's targeted risk assessment toward China. This act is all about achieving strategic autonomy and technological security.
Can we break that act down a bit? What are the specific pillars, the main things it tries to do to achieve this strategic autonomy?
Sure. CSPPA basically identifies 4 core pillars. First is supply chain resiliency. That means proactively identifying critical goods, think semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earth elements, and then either diversifying the sources away from single points of failure or actually establishing domestic production subsidies to bring manufacturing home.
Okay, secure the supply lines. What's second?
Second is critical infrastructure security. This specifically targets things like communications networks, utilities, financial systems, trying to prevent foreign infiltration or disruption. Very sensitive areas.
Makes sense. Third.
The third pillar is public-private R&D support. This focuses heavily on protecting proprietary technology in really cutting-edge emerging fields like quantum computing and AI, investing in the future, basically.
Yeah, the fourth?
And the fourth is patent security, strengthening measures against technology leakage, often through stricter foreign investment screening and reforming export controls.
Wow. It sounds like a complete re-engineering of the relationship between commerce and state security.
Yeah.
Very comprehensive.
It is, and apparently internal documents related to drafting this act reference China something like 41 times.
41 times. So absolutely no ambiguity about the target of the risk assessment.
None whatsoever. It's not a generic policy aimed at everyone. It is a specific, targeted response to perceived vulnerabilities, many exposed or heightened by China's rising power, and, frankly, previous coercive actions.
And beyond just the legislation, Japan has pursued concrete steps to try and mitigate that dependency, often under this umbrella term, the China Plus One strategy.
That's right.
The idea there is pretty simple, right? Keep your existing base in China, maybe, but diversify any new investment elsewhere, usually Southeast Asia, just to reduce that over-reliance.
Yes, that's the concept. And the government actually backed this with quite pragmatic measures, like the Supply Chain Diversification Support Project, or SCDSP.
That too.
It specifically provided funding, subsidies for firms willing to relocate certain production lines out of China. This was a direct, pragmatic, short-term measure really developed in triage mode during the major supply shocks we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, when suddenly everyone realized where everything was made.
Exactly.
But hang on, earlier you mentioned the power of those agglomeration economies. Given how deep that integration is, how effective can these diversification efforts really be in the grand scheme of things? It sounds a bit like, putting a small Band-Aid on a very large wound.
That is the functional limitation. You're absolutely right. While the SCDSP was successful in moving some production, usually non-critical, maybe more labor-intensive stuff, it is structurally constrained.
Not constrained.
Well, analysts estimate that compared to Japan's total foreign direct investment, FDI, stock in China, which is just massive and deeply integrated over decades, these relocation efforts are pretty marginal, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
Full-scale decoupling, pulling everything out, it remains economically catastrophic for many sectors.
Because you can't just move that specialized tooling or that whole dense supply chain easily.
Exactly. Not without prohibitive cost and enormous amounts of time. So the diversification we're seeing, it's definitely a hedge. It's risk mitigation. But it's not a full exit strategy, not even close for most industries.
Yeah, okay. So if they can't fully decouple economically, and they clearly refuse to decouple strategically from the U.S. alliance,
Yeah.
they just have to manage this inherent tension, right? You've got simultaneous, deep, unavoidable engagement and explicit security-focused hedging. The persistence of this bifurcation, maybe that is the strategic functionality itself.
I think that's exactly right. The bifurcation proves that policy can be, and in this case has to be, temporally and functionally split. The fact that Japan maintains a pretty standard nerealist security posture, that's the hedging track, doesn't automatically negate its complex economic interests, the engagement track.
They can coexist.
They have to. The sophistication lies in treating security and economics, to some extent, as separate policy domains. This allows them to cooperate deeply in one area, say, automotive parts production, while maintaining pretty fierce geopolitical competition in another.
And this sophistication, it extends into using multilateral frameworks, too, as a kind of collective leverage.
Absolutely. They use agreements like the CPTPP, which we mentioned as a high standard agreement, and also the Japan-EU Economic Partnership to promote a rule-based economic order. These frameworks serve two purposes.
Which are?
One, they promote prosperity for Japan through trade and investment. Two, they act as a collective balance by creating this sort of high-standard economic club that non-members, including China, must eventually contend with if they want full access and integration. It sets norms.
And finally, in this hedging track, we have to look at the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, FOIP, often paired with the Quad, the US, Japan, Australia, India. This looks very clearly like a hedging strategy against China's regional dominance.
FOIP is undoubtedly a centerpiece of Japan's balancing act. Now, while the concept itself doesn't explicitly exclude China, in fact, former PMA have even suggested cooperation under certain BRI conditions, remember?
Right, the conditional engagement.
But its strong association with security frameworks like the Quad clearly positions it as a counterweight. But I think the genius of FOIP, why it gets traction, is its positive, constructive agenda. That's why many nations in Southeast Asia, for example, tend to trust Japan to lead on it.
What specific initiatives are defining that FOIP narrative beyond just, say, naval exercises or security talk? What's the positive agenda?
The focus is heavily on things like promoting quality infrastructure standards, implicitly contrasting with some BRI projects' digital connectivity, and providing public goods. For example, the Quad has committed to major initiatives in vaccine diplomacy during the pandemic. They offer high-quality infrastructure funding as an alternative to potentially opaque BRI deals. They work on setting norms for technology security.
So it's about being a reliable partner.
Exactly. Japan is seen as a reliable security and economic partner, a provider of public goods, often perceived as having fewer political strings attached compared to others. This makes the FOIP concept a really powerful soft power element in the overall hedging strategy. Japan's ability to be seen as this reliable security partner, while still maintaining those deep economic ties with China, that's the functional core of its strategic success, managing that paradox.
Okay, so if Japan's dual approach is born out of necessity, this dilemma, what about China's strategy? It seems China also operates on a dual-track economic integration paired with military assertiveness. But is it more of a deliberate, complementary strategy designed to reshape the regional order?
That's a very insightful way to frame it. I think it is more deliberate and complementary. It's about creating leverage, yes, but also establishing strategic deterrence and shaping perceptions.
Let's start with the first track, the power of economic integration. Some analysts might call it a benevolent facade, but maybe we should frame it more neutrally as highly successful strategic diplomacy.
I think that's fair. China has very deliberately positioned itself as the central economic hub in the Indo-Pacific. The BRI and RCEP are the primary vehicles for this.
And RCEP, as we discussed, is just a massive mechanism for cementing this status, right? Integrating all these major regional economies, ASEAN, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, into one huge trade framework. The sheer scale of that regional market just pulls everyone inward.
It creates immense economic gravity, and the BRI reinforces this pull. Now, the projects themselves, the ports, the rail lines, the digital networks, they are framed as developmental partnerships. And in many cases, they do promote genuine, much-needed local economic development.
Which countries welcome?
Of course. At the same time, this undoubtedly increases China's strategic influence. But we should perhaps ask, is this automatically sinister? Or is it simply a standard, highly successful diplomatic strategy where economic strength is leveraged to gain political alignment? The strategy is arguably effective precisely because the economic carrot offers genuine prosperity and infrastructure that others may not be willing or able to provide on the same scale or speed.
Okay, that's a fair point. But where does that line get crossed? Where does it shift from mutually beneficial investment to something more like strategic leverage? We do see clear outcomes in nations like Cambodia, Laos, the Solomon Islands. they have aligned increasingly with Beijing diplomatically.
I think the shift, or where the perception of leverage becomes strongest, occurs when the economic relationship moves beyond just trade and investment into explicit security agreements. Look at the 2022 Solomon Islands China Security Pact.
Right, that caused a lot of waves.
It did, because that pact allows for the potential deployment of Chinese security forces. That looks like a direct outcome, where years of sustained economic engagement and dependency successfully blended with strategic outreach, transforming into tangible security alignment.
It's easy, maybe too easy, for Western analysts to immediately label any alignment as coercion or the result of debt traps. But is there a real functional difference here for the governments involved, like Cambodia or Laos? Are they simply benefiting from infrastructure that, say, the US or Japan aren't offering? Or is China's economic approach fundamentally tying prosperity to a kind of strategic submission?
That's where the nuance is absolutely essential. For many developing nations, the immediate benefits, a new port that boosts trade, a major highway financed quickly, these are real and significantly aid development. China often provides capital without the extensive political conditionalities, sometimes attached by multilateral banks or Western donors.
Which is appealing.
Very appealing. However, the system seems designed, perhaps implicitly, to ensure that those deep economic ties create strong political incentives for alignment. When a state benefits so profoundly from trade and investment with one major partner, challenging that partner's core interests becomes politically and economically very costly. So it's perhaps a sophisticated application of integration where economic success naturally sets the diplomatic stage. #2, disciplined military assertiveness, strategic signaling.
Okay, so while the economic track is broadly one of integration and mutual benefit, at least on the surface, the security track seems characterized by a very disciplined military assertiveness, designed purely for strategic signaling, maybe.
I think disciplined and strategic signaling are the right terms.
Exactly. The People's Liberation Army, the PLA, particularly under Xi Jinping, has clearly transitioned from what was primarily a defensive force focused on territorial integrity to an explicit tool of foreign policy projection.
We see that embodied in doctrines like Farsi's protection. Right, aiming to transition the PLA Navy into a powerful blue water force capable of operating globally. This kind of capability demonstration is seen as essential for deterrence in the modern era.
When we look at specific maneuvers, though, like that February 2025 PLA Navy live fire drill near Australia, way out in the South Pacific,
Right.
The rhetoric from countries like Australia was pretty alarmist.
Understandably so. It was certainly viewed by Australia and its allies as a direct military signal, maybe even a threat, a significant escalation in capability signaling far from China's shores. However, China's Ministry of National Defense framed the drill, predictably, as simply enhancing combat readiness.
Standard military justification.
Right. So we have to consider this from a strategic perspective. Was this unprovoked escalation designed purely to intimidate, or was it, from Beijing's viewpoint, a necessary response to perceived shifts in the regional balance of power, like the formation of the AUKUS pact between Australia, the UK, and the US? Demonstrating blue water capability in response to potential containment efforts is, within the logic of deterrence theory, pretty standard strategic signaling.
And closer to home, they rely heavily on these gray zone operations, don't they? Designed to assert claims but operate below the threshold of triggering an actual armed conflict. This seems to be where the discipline is most apparent.
Absolutely. Gray zone tactics are highly calculated, highly calibrated. They rely heavily on paramilitary forces, primarily the maritime militias, often disguised as large fishing fleets, but also, crucially, the China Coast Guard, the CCG.
Which isn't technically the Navy.
Exactly, and the discipline here is paramount. These forces execute precise, coordinated tactics designed to change the status quo on the ground, or water, incrementally, without provoking a military response that could be justified under international law.
Can you give us a specific example of why this is so effective? Maybe this situation around the Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea.
That's a perfect example. The Philippines periodically attempts to resupply its small military detachment stationed on a deliberately grounded naval vessel there, the BRP Sierra Madre. The CCG consistently responds, but not usually with naval destroyers. They use large, typically unarmed, white-hulled CCG vessels.
And they use things like water cannons.
Water cannons, deliberate ramming maneuvers, blocking positions, laser pointing, tactics designed to obstruct and intimidate. This is effective because, legally and politically, responding to a CCG vessel, a law enforcement vessel with a conventional naval weapon from the Philippines Navy, would likely be seen internationally as a disproportionate escalation. It could trigger a major crisis.
While the CCG actions are framed as just maritime patrol or law enforcement.
Precisely. So this calculated use of non-military or paramilitary assets achieves China's tactical goals of obstructing resupply, asserting administrative control over the waters, reinforcing territorial claims very efficiently, all while maintaining the political ability to deny that a military confrontation has occurred. It keeps the situation just below the boiling point. #3. Strategic messaging.
Okay, so we have the economic cooperation providing the carrot, offering benefits, and then the military signaling and gray zone actions providing the stick, or at least a very clear warning. These two tracks seem explicitly linked in the overall strategic messaging, don't they?
I think they're inseparable. They have to be viewed together. The deep economic cooperation often carries an implicit or sometimes explicit expectation of political alignment, or at least non-opposition on core interests.
And when resistance does occur, especially if it's seen as challenging China's core interests,
the response is often swift and targeted. Analysts are quick to label this as coercion, and certainly from the perspective of the target country, it feels coercive.
the classic example that always comes up is the Australian trade sanctions, right? Imposed after Australia called for an independent international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Suddenly, over a dozen sectors face restrictions: wine, barley, coal, timber.
That's the key example. While undeniably painful for Australian exporters and clearly intended as a signal, we should try to contextualize it within standard international relations, perhaps. If any nation takes an action that another powerful state defines as directly challenging its core interests, whether that's national security, political legitimacy, or territorial integrity, some form of proportionate economic or political reaction is, unfortunately, pretty predictable within the geopolitical system.
It's pushback.
It's pushback. China's strategy seems designed to ensure that the potential costs of non-cooperation or perceived opposition are explicitly understood by its partners. This reinforces the effectiveness of the overall dual approach. The constant calibration offering prosperity and integration alongside the unmistakable clarity of its security signals and red lines that seems to be key to how China aims to manage regional stability, largely on its terms.
Okay, to really see this strategic fusion, maybe, of the economic and security tracks in action, the 2010 Senkaku Islands crisis is almost required reading, isn't it?
Yeah.
It shows pretty starkly how China leveraged Japan's deep economic vulnerabilities as a tactical instrument of statecraft.
It's a critical case study, absolutely. The immediate crisis was triggered back in September 2010 when a Chinese fishing trawler rammed 2 Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the disputed islands.
Which Japan administers, but China also claims.
Exactly. And these islands are crucial, not just because of the intense historical dispute, but because of their geostrategic value in the East China Sea controlling sea lanes and the potential for significant undersea oil and gas deposits nearby.
So Japan detained the captain of the trawler, and China's response was immediate, and it came on multiple fronts.
It was incredibly rapid and seemed designed to overwhelm Tokyo's political apparatus. The immediate diplomatic pressure was intense. I think the Japanese ambassador in Beijing was summoned 6 times in a single week. Yeah. High-level bilateral cooperation, including sensitive talks on joint resource development in the East China Sea, was immediately suspended. Then, China dramatically increased the pressure by arresting 4 Japanese nationals on espionage charges, maximizing the diplomatic crisis at a very sensitive moment. They also effectively implemented travel warnings, which hit Japanese tourism and scaled back cultural exchanges temporarily.
But the real strategic blow, the thing everyone remembers, was the weaponization of rare earth elements, the REs.
That move exposed a potentially catastrophic economic dependency for Japan. Back in 2009, just before the crisis, China controlled something like 97% of the global supply of processed REs.
97%, almost a total monopoly.
Almost. And these elements, things like neodymium, dysprosium, they are absolutely critical for modern high-tech manufacturing. You need them for the powerful magnets in hybrid car engines, which was Toyota's core technology then, and for components across Japanese electronics, defense technology, wind turbines.
And Japan was heavily reliant on China for these.
Hugely reliant. Japan depended on China for over 90% of its RE needs. In fact, Japan was, at that time, the destination for nearly half of China's total RE exports. So a massive vulnerability.
So when China unofficially restricted exports of these unprocessed REs, specifically to Japan in late September 2010, the Japanese high-tech sector basically went into panic mode.
It was industrial triage. Japanese businesses, particularly electronics producers, had to scramble. They resorted to emergency measures like trying to airlift supplies from third-party sources, paying premium prices. Companies started modeling potential supply shortages within maybe 6 months if the embargo continued. This was the clear stick, a devastating demonstration of China's ability and willingness to use a potent economic instrument for coercive punishment when it felt a core political issue like sovereignty over the islands was challenged.
But the restriction wasn't just punitive, was it? It seems there was also a clear industrial policy objective behind it.
Absolutely. That's the other crucial layer. The second objective seems to have been forward-looking, to actually force industrial relocation into China. China restricted the export of raw or lightly processed REs, but often left the export of highly processed REs or components made with them relatively untouched.
Creating an incentive to move production.
Exactly. This incentivized large Japanese companies, names like Toyota, Hitachi Metals, TDK Corporation, were mentioned to seriously consider relocating their high-value-add RE processing and magnet manufacturing operations to China itself. Why? To mitigate the risk of future supply disruptions.
So China gets the higher value industry.
Right. This looked like a desired long-term strategic result for China's own industrial upgrade goals, moving up the value chain, leveraging geopolitical pressure to achieve a specific economic gain. Very strategic. #3. Political fallout and strategic testing.
Okay, so despite the severity of that economic pressure, Japan did react quickly afterwards, didn't they? They tried to diversify their RE sources. What were the limitations of those post-crisis diversification efforts?
Yes, Japan realized immediately the vulnerability was simply unsustainable. Post-2010, they launched major initiatives. They funded exploration and development of new RE sources, partnering with countries like Australia, India, and Vietnam. They subsidized Japanese companies researching RE-free magnet technology, trying to design around the problem. And they began establishing strategic national reserve stockpiles of critical REs.
So a multi-pronged response.
Definitely. However, the limitation was structural, and it took time. Even after finding new raw materials overseas, building the incredibly complex processing infrastructure needed to purify and refine those elements into usable metals takes years and enormous investment. China had spent decades building that capacity.
So the economic gravity, that dependency, it still pulled them back to some extent.
It did, for quite a while. Reports suggest that even 5 years after the crisis, despite all those efforts, Japan's reliance on China for processed REs still remains stubbornly high, maybe in the 80–90% range for many key elements. Yeah. It really demonstrates that while the crisis-proved economic interdependence could be leveraged tactically, the sheer depth of that integration, especially in specialized areas, limited the feasibility of full, rapid, long-term decoupling. It's just not that easy.
And internally in Japan, the crisis exposed some profound domestic political vulnerabilities, didn't it? The government at the time faced intense criticism for how it handled the incident.
Oh, absolutely. Prime Minister Naoto Kan's government lost significant political capital over it. He was criticized from both sides, simultaneously accused of escalating the crisis unnecessarily by detaining the Chinese captain in the first place, and then showing weakness by releasing him just days later under intense Chinese pressure.
A no-win situation politically.
Pretty much. And this internal political instability was arguably an ancillary benefit for China, distracting Tokyo. More importantly, perhaps, the incident was analyzed by many observers afterwards as potentially an execution of a kind of pre-designed confrontation scenario.
Meaning what? Designed to test Japan.
Designed to test Japan's resolve, yes, and also maybe test the operational limits of its defenses around the islands. And crucially, it was seen as an attempt to gauge the reliability of the U.S. commitment under the Security Treaty.
And how did the U.S. respond during the crisis?
The U.S. response was somewhat cautious initially. While affirming the treaty applied to the islands later, the Obama administration was notably not extremely vocal or explicit in its public support during the peak of the crisis itself. This ambiguity was likely noted in Beijing.
So the overall conclusion from the 2010 Senkaku crisis seems pretty clear then.
I think so. Economic interdependence is clearly not a guarantee of peace. In fact, it can be a powerful strategic tool that can be weaponized tactically. But at the same time, the sheer scale and depth of that economic relationship limits the extent to which it can be completely abandoned or ruptured without massive self-harm. It creates constraints on both sides.
Which brings us back full circle almost. to the analytical framework we need to make sense of this enduring paradox. We need concepts like functional and temporal decoupling, right? We have to acknowledge the primacy of security concerns alongside the immovable reality of deep economic integration.
Exactly. The foundation of this analysis, I think, still rests on the concept of neorealist primacy, particularly for state actors. When push really comes to shove, national security tends to take precedence over purely economic considerations.
We see that in actions like Japan's accelerated development of ballistic missile defense, BMD, or China's massive military modernization.
Classic security dilemma responses, yes. Policymakers are often driven by perceptions of threat, rightly or wrongly. And in this kind of high-stakes environment, purely economic calculations often fail to dictate core security decisions. Security comes first.
Okay, so if neorealism dictates the high-level trajectory, the security focus, how does the economy play its role then? Is it just a distraction or background noise?
Not at all. Not a distraction. Economic interdependence functions as a really powerful intervening variable. It may not prevent the security dilemma from existing, but it acts as a powerful restraining force that manages the intensity and the speed of escalation between rivals.
How does it do that?
Primarily, it creates powerful domestic interest groups, businesses, industries, financial sectors that are deeply invested in maintaining peace and stability simply to protect their substantial profits and investments.
Can you give an example of those powerful interest groups in Japan that might actively restrain the security hawks?
Well, the prime example is usually the Keidanren, Japan's largest and most influential business lobby. They represent thousands of companies, including many of those 7,700 affiliates operating in China we mentioned earlier, companies whose bottom lines depend heavily on the continuity of the commercial relationship.
So they lobby for stability.
Their lobbying efforts absolutely act as a kind of brake on excessively hostile political rhetoric or overly aggressive security policies that might threaten trade access or supply chain stability. This creates a powerful domestic constituency for stability, counterbalancing the security hardliners.
And institutional mechanisms help manage the friction too, right? Things like the WTO or RCEP, trying to prevent every trade spat from spilling over into high-level political conflict.
Absolutely. Those mechanisms we discussed, the WTO and now RCEP more regionally, are designed precisely to manage trade friction and disputes within a rule-based environment. They essentially try to isolate economic competition as much as possible from the direct security conflict. This is the core idea of functional decoupling.
Right, separating the functions.
You can pursue deep, profitable economic engagement, let's call it functional coupling, in non-sensitive sectors like consumer goods or auto parts, while simultaneously maintaining a firm external balancing security posture, functional competition. The two functions run independently on parallel tracks, #2, temporal decoupling in Japanese strategy.
And Japan's response to this tension, it also seems organized by time, doesn't it? Which you call temporal decoupling. It seems like a multi-layered strategy that allows for short-term adjustments, like dealing with a crisis, without necessarily rupturing the long-term engagement goals.
That's a good way to visualize it. We can think of Japan's strategy perhaps in 3 layers, all built upon a stable foundation. And a surface layer, you have the immediate short-term adjustments. Things like the SCDSP subsidies we talked about, or immediate diplomatic responses to incidents or crises. These are tactical moves, reacting to events.
Okay, surface level is tactical. What's the middle layer? That must be the institutional and structural moves we discussed.
Exactly. That's where the more enduring structure is built. This includes things like setting up the NSC Economic Unit, passing legislation like the CSPIA, and ratifying those big multilateral agreements like CPTPP and RCEP. These take years to fully implement and have their effect, but they're designed to create long-term stability and resilience.
Right, building the framework. And the most important layer, the deepest one, must be the foundational layer.
That has to be the unwavering U.S. alliance. That provides the ultimate security guarantee, the bedrock. And layered onto that, perhaps just above it, is the basic approach layer defined by that free and open Indo-Pacific concept.
The guiding vision.
A guiding vision. Japan's overall strategy, the way they try to tie these different temporal layers together, really seems aimed at bridge building through rulemaking and norm setting. They appear to be trying to manage the inherent tension between the U.S. and China by creating a robust regional structure where standards, rules, and transparency are paramount.
This aspiration for some kind of shared future, despite the tensions, it was even captured in that concept of kyuzu, wasn't it? Usually translated as co-creation, which was being discussed around the time of Xi Jinping's planned state visit to Japan back in 2020. before the pandemic hit.
Yes, Kyushu is highly reflective of that long-term engagement track. LDP Secretary General Toshihiro Nikai, who was a prominent figure in the pro-engagement faction within Japan's ruling party, actually suggested Japan and China could play a central role in the co-creation of the world.
That's pretty ambitious rhetoric.
Very ambitious. It implies a clear aspiration for positive long-term interdependence, acknowledging the potential for a shared future, or at least shared management of global issues, despite all the short-term security friction.
But there's always a cautious voice, isn't there? Especially when security issues are paramount. Not everyone buys into co-creation.
Indeed. And rightly so from a realist perspective. Influential scholars like Akio Takahara, for example, expressed a much more cautious approach around that time. They suggested that while co-creation might be a nice long-term ideal, the immediate focus must remain on ensuring national security and managing the relationship through clear, rules-based engagement, not just hopeful rhetoric. The coexistence of these different views, the need for short-term security adjustments alongside those mid- and long-term engagement mechanisms, really demonstrates temporal decoupling in action. They pursue the ideal, perhaps, while preparing pragmatically for the worst. #3, broader applicability and future trajectory.
So this framework we've been discussing, functional and temporal decoupling, isn't really unique just to Tokyo and Beijing, is it? It seems to define the core Indo-Pacific paradox for pretty much the entire region.
I think that's correct. China's own dual-track strategy effectively forces nearly every regional nation into the same difficult, paradoxical position. They benefit immensely from Chinese investments and trade that often fuels their economic growth. But simultaneously, many feel compelled to hedge for security, often by strengthening ties with the US, Japan, Australia, India, or multilateral security groupings like the Quad.
So everyone's trying to balance.
Everyone's trying to balance. This inherent paradox means that outright, full-scale decoupling from China is simply not a viable or desirable strategy for regional stability or prosperity for most countries. They have to manage the duality.
And zooming back in on Japan, its strategy of conditional engagement, particularly with the BRI, actually proved somewhat effective in delivering some real influence, didn't it?
Yeah.
Which maybe challenges the idea sometimes heard that only hardline confrontation works with China.
That is a very significant finding from some analyses, yes. Japan's more moderate approach, consistently insisting on international standards like transparency and financial soundness for BRI projects they might cooperate on, did seem to successfully nudge China, at least rhetorically, toward adopting language about quality Belt and Road projects and emphasizing multilateral frameworks more.
So words changed, at least.
Words changed, and perhaps some practices on the margins. Now, we have to be realistic. This influence is likely limited mainly to the economic aspects of BRI, and it probably doesn't extend to changing China's core security behavior or territorial claims. But it does demonstrate that moderate, persistent, rule-based engagement can shift rhetoric and maybe even some behavior in specific economic sectors. It suggests that institutional leverage is real, even if limited.
Okay, finally looking ahead. What long-term domestic factors inside China might shape the future trajectory of its own dual-track strategy? Are there internal pressures that could change things?
I think the ultimate long-term variable everyone is watching is China's demographic transition. It's undeniable. The working-age population reportedly began its decline around 2010, maybe a bit later, and that trend is accelerating dramatically now.
The aging society challenge.
Exactly. An aging society means a potentially smaller labor force, certainly increased social security and healthcare burdens, and likely a structural slowdown in the traditional manufacturing-led growth model that powered China's rise.
And this internal demographic pressure, it must require a massive shift in economic strategy just to maintain growth and stability.
It almost certainly does. Policymakers in Beijing are already focused on investing heavily in automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, and advanced manufacturing, trying to boost productivity. It's what some economists, like Professor Barry Naughton, have termed the grand steerage of the economy. This focus on internal efficiency and technological self-sufficiency, often encapsulated by the dual circulation economic concept.
Which emphasizes the domestic market more.
Right. It emphasizes strengthening the domestic market and achieving key technological independence. This could necessitate a gradual shift toward a more inward-looking policy overall, focused on internal challenges, domestic consumption, and technological upgrades.
So this internal focus might actually, over the longer term, reduce the intensity of China's external assertiveness.
That is one possible projection. While some analysts suggest that China's external assertiveness, especially concerning territorial claims like Taiwan or the South China Sea, might peak sometime in the next decade, maybe around 2030, before the demographic crunch really begins to bite hard, this long-term internal focus may fundamentally alter the nature and intensity of external engagement further down the road.
How so?
Well, simply put, economic resources and political attention may increasingly need to be diverted internally to manage the demographic shift and maintain social stability. This could potentially make large-scale, costly external military projection or expansion less feasible, or perhaps just less of a priority in the decades to come. Demographics could be destiny in a way.
So what does this all mean for us, trying to understand this complex relationship? We started with what looked like a massive contradiction, the harsh security threat language versus the smiles at the cultural harmony event. What we seem to have found is that this isn't a mistake or a bug in the system. Maybe it's the entire highly functional strategic point.
Precisely. I think that's the key takeaway. Both China and Japan operate under the clear understanding that they are fundamentally tied together by an undeniable economic gravity, even while they simultaneously maintain distinct security postures driven by deep-seated neorealist concerns. Their relationship is incredibly complex because it is functionally decoupled, as we discussed.
You can have both at once.
You can have deep economic integration coexisting with intense military competition and strategic hedging. This highly sophisticated, almost routine management of parallel tracks, this duality, is perhaps the key to understanding how stability, however tense, is maintained in East Asia today.
It's a really compelling look at the limits of trying to force one track, either economics or security, to completely dominate the other. It shows how pragmatism, maybe sophisticated institutional design through things like RCEP, and just the sheer inertia of economic integration keep perhaps the most tense and important bilateral relationship in the region from completely breaking down.
And the strategic focus of China from this analysis seems clearly geared towards advancing its own long-term objectives through both the powerful carrot of deep economic ties and development assistance and the explicit clarity of its security signals and red lines. By engaging constructively in rule-based frameworks where it suits them and offering tangible benefits, China ensures the potential costs of non-cooperation are well understood, while continually reinforcing that possibility of a co-creation framework for the future on terms it finds acceptable.